The Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, located in the far northwest of China, presents a striking contradiction. On its surface, it is a sprawling, resource-rich territory that plays a pivotal role in China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative, projecting an image of modernity, economic development, and multicultural coexistence. Beneath that surface, however, lies a deeply troubling reality, one that has drawn condemnation from human rights organizations, foreign governments, and international legal bodies alike. The region has become the site of what many experts, courts, and governments have characterized as one of the most systematic and large-scale campaigns of ethnic and religious persecution in the 21st century. At the center of this crisis are the Uyghurs, a Turkic-speaking, predominantly Muslim ethnic group with a distinct cultural identity, language, and history that predates Chinese sovereignty over the region by centuries. Understanding what has happened to the Uyghur people in Xinjiang requires tracing a long and complex arc of political tension, cultural suppression, state violence, and the gradual construction of a surveillance apparatus without parallel in the modern world. The Uyghurs number approximately 12 million in Xinjiang, and their language bears close resemblance to Turkish, reflecting their deeper cultural and ethnic affinities with the peoples of Central Asia, rather than with the Han Chinese majority that dominates the rest of China. For much of their history, the Uyghurs maintained a distinct civilization in the region they call East Turkestan. In the early 20th century, they briefly succeeded in establishing an independent state, but in 1949, following the consolidation of power by Mao Zedong and the People's Republic of China, the region was brought firmly under Chinese Communist Party control and renamed the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, a designation that, critics argue, has always been autonomous in name alone. From the earliest years of Chinese rule, the Uyghurs maintained a sense of separate identity and, in many cases, a desire for genuine self-determination. Independence movements and periodic acts of resistance punctuated the decades that followed, keeping Beijing perpetually wary of the region's loyalties and deeply suspicious of Uyghur cultural and religious institutions. Tensions escalated significantly during the 1990s as anti-Han sentiment and separatist activism grew more pronounced in Xinjiang. The Chinese government responded with increasingly aggressive security measures, characterizing Uyghur political aspirations as threats to national unity and, after the events of September 11, 2001, increasingly framing them within the global discourse on terrorism and Islamic extremism. This framing gave Beijing a convenient ideological justification for intensifying its presence in the region and suppressing dissent under the banner of counterterrorism. The situation reached a violent breaking point in July 2009, when protests in Urumqi, the regional capital, escalated into deadly ethnic clashes. Nearly 200 people died in the violence. The Chinese government attributed the majority of casualties to the Han population and blamed the unrest on Uyghur agitators. Many Uyghurs, however, disputed this account, arguing that the casualties on their side were significantly undercounted and that the violence had been sparked by legitimate grievances against systemic discrimination and economic marginalization. The groundwork for the most severe phase of the crackdown was laid in April 2014, when President Xi Jinping visited Xinjiang and delivered a series of private speeches to regional officials. These speeches, later leaked to international media as part of a cache of internal Chinese government documents, revealed the ideological and strategic framework behind what would become a campaign of mass detention. Xi called for an all-out struggle against terrorism, infiltration, and separatism, demanding the use of what he described as the weapons of dictatorship and insisting that there be absolutely no mercy shown. He pushed specifically for mass detentions and a sweeping anti-radicalization campaign, framing the entire Uyghur population, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority adhered to moderate religious traditions and had no connection to extremist activity, as a potential threat requiring comprehensive management and ideological transformation. The visits coincided with a period of genuine instability, including bombings and stabbings carried out by a small number of radicals in Xinjiang and in other parts of China, but the response that emerged was wildly disproportionate in its scope, targeting an entire ethnic and religious community rather than the individuals responsible for violence. Beginning in earnest in 2017, Chinese authorities launched a campaign of mass detention that the United Nations estimates has resulted in the internment of more than 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities, including Kazakhs and Kyrgyz. These individuals were held in a network of facilities that the Chinese government initially denied existed and later described as voluntary vocational training centers designed to combat extremism through education. Satellite imagery told a different story. Researchers and journalists who analyzed commercially available satellite photographs documented the extraordinarily rapid construction of large, fortified complexes across Xinjiang, facilities surrounded by watchtowers, razor wire, and high walls bearing far more resemblance to prisons than to schools or job training centers. The scale and speed of their construction made clear that this was not an improvised response to a security crisis, but a deliberate, planned, and centrally organized infrastructure for mass incarceration. The experiences of those who passed through these facilities, documented through interviews conducted by journalists, human rights organizations, and researchers in countries where some Uyghurs had managed to seek refuge, are harrowing in their consistency and detail. Detainees described being held for months or years without charge, without trial, and without any meaningful opportunity to challenge their detention, or even to understand when or whether they would be released. Inside the camps, inmates were subjected to intensive programs of political indoctrination. They were required to attend lectures on Communist Party ideology, to sing songs praising the party and its leadership, and to write lengthy self-criticism essays renouncing their religious beliefs, their cultural practices, and their sense of ethnic identity. The explicit goal of these programs was to strip detainees of any attachment to Islam, their prayers, their dietary restrictions, their religious calendar, their sacred texts, and to replace that attachment with unconditional loyalty to the Chinese state and its ruling party. Those who resisted or who were deemed insufficiently compliant faced punishment. Beyond the psychological dimensions of the indoctrination, survivor accounts describe conditions of profound physical brutality. Former detainees have reported beatings, stress positions, sleep deprivation, and other forms of physical abuse inflicted by guards. Women, in particular, have described systematic sexual violence, including rape and other forms of sexual abuse perpetrated by camp personnel. These accounts, initially dismissed or minimized by Chinese authorities, have been corroborated by multiple independent sources and are consistent across testimonies, gathered in different countries from individuals with no apparent connection to one another. The Chinese government's response to these allegations has included harassment campaigns targeting the women who came forward. According to documented reports, Chinese officials contacted survivors living abroad through their social media accounts and by phone, threatened them and their family members still living in China, attempted to hack their devices, and orchestrated smear campaigns through state media. A coordinated effort to intimidate witnesses into silence and discredit testimony that the government could not otherwise refute. Beyond the camps themselves, the entire region of Xinjiang has been transformed into what researchers have described as an open-air prison, a totalizing surveillance state in which virtually every dimension of daily life is monitored, recorded, and subject to state intervention. The Chinese government has deployed an extraordinary array of surveillance technologies throughout the region. Cameras capable of facial recognition have been installed at extraordinary density across cities, towns, and even rural areas, logging the movements of residents and cross-referencing them against databases maintained by security agencies. Voice recognition technology has been used to monitor phone conversations. A mobile application used by police in Xinjiang, documented through reverse engineering by Human Rights Watch, allowed authorities to track individuals' behavior, flag those deemed suspicious, and initiate investigations based on algorithmic assessments of risk. Assessments that could be triggered by something as ordinary as using a virtual private network, contacting someone abroad, or praying outside of officially sanctioned venues. In some cases, surveillance cameras have reportedly been installed inside private homes. Checkpoints are ubiquitous throughout the region, requiring residents to submit to identity checks and biometric scans simply to move through their own communities. The suppression of religious life has been equally comprehensive. In 2017, Xi Jinping issued a directive requiring that all religions practiced in China be Chinese in orientation, a policy that in practice has meant the systematic dismantling of institutions, practices, and expressions of faith that do not conform to state-approved forms. For Uyghurs, this has translated into the destruction or forced architectural modification of mosques, the removal of minarets and domes that Chinese authorities deem too reminiscent of Middle Eastern Islamic aesthetics, and the prohibition of a wide range of religious practices. Religious education for minors has been banned. Fasting during Ramadan has been restricted or prohibited for certain categories of people, including students and government employees. Uyghurs who wish to enter a mosque are required to register with authorities and worship under the surveillance of cameras and informants. Most significantly, Uyghur Muslims have been barred from making the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca since 2016. Muslims in China are required to obtain government permission for this journey, and that permission has simply not been granted to Uyghurs, severing one of the most fundamental obligations of Islamic practice and further isolating the community from the global Muslim world. The cultural erasure has extended to language and education as well. The Uyghur language, which represents not merely a means of communication but a living repository of history, literature, and collective identity, has been subjected to restrictions in schools, with Mandarin Chinese instruction increasingly mandated at the expense of Uyghur language education. This mirrors the approach documented in Tibet, where Chinese authorities have similarly restricted the teaching of the Tibetan language, demonstrating a broader pattern of cultural homogenization applied to ethnic minorities whose distinct identities Beijing perceives as a challenge to national unity. Demographic engineering has accompanied these cultural and religious pressures. Over recent decades, the Chinese state has actively encouraged and facilitated the migration of Han Chinese, China's dominant ethnic group, into Xinjiang, fundamentally altering the population composition of a region where Uyghurs were once a clear majority. This policy, which critics characterize as deliberate demographic dilution, has had profound consequences for the political and economic standing of Uyghurs in their own homeland, as Han migrants have disproportionately occupied positions of economic and administrative power, further marginalizing the indigenous population. Uyghur activists and scholars have argued that this demographic transformation, combined with the mass detention program and the assault on cultural and religious identity, constitutes a form of genocide, an effort not necessarily to physically eliminate the Uyghur people but to destroy the conditions that make their continued existence as a distinct people possible. The question of accountability has proven deeply frustrating. In 2022, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights released a long-awaited report on the situation in Xinjiang, which documented serious human rights violations and concluded that China's actions may constitute international crimes, including crimes against humanity. The report was significant, representing the first formal assessment of the situation by the principal human rights body of the United Nations. However, the structural realities of international governance have severely constrained the ability of the international community to translate documentation into accountability. China holds a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, giving it veto power over any resolution that might authorize meaningful enforcement action. This architectural feature of the post-World War II international order has rendered the UN largely impotent in the face of human rights violations committed by any of the 5 permanent members or their close allies. In the absence of effective multilateral action through the UN, a coalition of Western democracies pursued coordinated responses through other mechanisms. In March 2021, the United States, the European Union, the United Kingdom, and Canada imposed targeted sanctions on Chinese officials deemed responsible for the human rights abuses in Xinjiang. The first time the European Union had sanctioned China since the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. The United States went further by enacting the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which established a rebuttable presumption that goods produced wholly or in part in Xinjiang are made with forced labor and therefore prohibited from importation into the United States. This legislation reflected growing evidence that the detention and labor transfer programs in Xinjiang were integrated into global supply chains, with major international corporations potentially benefiting from the coerced labor of Uyghur detainees in factories producing goods sold around the world. In January 2021, then-Secretary of State Mike Pompeo formally designated the situation in Xinjiang as genocide, a designation that the Biden administration affirmed upon taking office, marking a rare instance of bipartisan consensus on a major foreign policy determination. Perhaps the most comprehensive legal assessment came from the Court of the Citizens of the World, an independent people's tribunal, which, after examining extensive evidence, found China guilty of genocide and crimes against humanity committed against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, as well as of serious atrocities in Tibet. While such tribunals lack binding enforcement authority, their findings carry moral and political weight, particularly in shaping international public opinion and informing the deliberations of governments and intergovernmental organizations. Throughout all of this, the Chinese government has maintained an aggressive and multifaceted campaign of denial and countermessaging. Officials have consistently rejected allegations of abuse, characterizing international criticism as interference in China's internal affairs, and as a politically motivated effort by Western powers to destabilize the country. State media have broadcast carefully produced videos purporting to show happy, prosperous Uyghurs celebrating their culture and expressing gratitude to the Chinese government. The government has organized press tours for select foreign journalists and diplomats, providing curated access to facilities and communities in Xinjiang designed to project normalcy and refute allegations of persecution. These efforts, however, have consistently failed to withstand scrutiny. The testimony of survivors, the evidence contained in leaked government documents, the findings of satellite imagery analysis, and the conclusions reached by independent researchers have collectively built a body of evidence that is difficult to dismiss and that continues to challenge the narrative Beijing seeks to project to the world. What has unfolded in Xinjiang represents not merely a regional human rights crisis, but a fundamental test of the international community's capacity and willingness to respond to state-perpetrated atrocities when the perpetrating state is a major global power with significant economic leverage and institutional protection. The Uyghur people have endured the dismantling of their religious life, the suppression of their language and culture, the detention of their family members, and the systematic destruction of the social fabric that sustains their identity as a people. Whether the international community will ultimately muster a response commensurate with the scale of what has occurred remains one of the defining moral and political questions of the present era.